the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Call Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, if there is one thing that the Prisoners and Victims Claims Continuation and Reform Amendment Bill is not, it is a victims' rights piece of legislation. It is not about enhancing victims' rights at all. It is a very much lottery-driven piece of legislation when it comes to victims' rights. So the genesis of the original legislation was what is known as the Taunoa case, which provided or made awards of damages to prisoners whose Bill of Rights had been traduced through the behaviour management regime then in place in prisons in New Zealand. It resulted in awards of compensation, so effectively the state compensated or was required to compensate the prisoners. The difficulty was seen at the time, a new injustice was created, that the prisoners whose rights had been breached and who won compensation as a consequence themselves, it is self-evident, had breached the rights of their victims who had no claim against them. And under the personal liability or common law rights that those victims had, they had lost the right to make a claim, even putting aside the accident compensation rights they had. They could not make a claim for exemplary damages for the conduct of the prisoners. So the prisoners enjoyed a windfall and the victims continued to suffer the consequences of the crimes committed against them. The government of the day, the Labor government, introduced the legislation to ensure that any awards of damages went to compensate both the state and the victims before the prisoners themselves received any amount of compensation. So that situation was not and will not be under the legislation we're now considering without conflicting values and principles. It is not right that prisoners should be subject to mistreatment while in prison. We sentence people to prison to deprive them of their liberty as a sanction against their antisocial conduct. We don't send them to prison to be further mistreated and abused and treated in improper ways. That's not acceptable. And so it is correct that the state, who is the custodian of these people while they are incarcerated, should themselves face a sanction. Equally, it is wrong that access to compensation by victims should be dependent on what might be described as the entirely fortuitous circumstance that the perpetrator of the crime against them is him or herself subject to a violation that leads to a compensable right, that leads to compensation that can then be claimed by the victim. That doesn't deal with victims' rights at all, and so there are limitations. And so while we can understand that there is an injustice that ought to be addressed and continue to be addressed, it is not a satisfactory conclusion or resolution to the overarching issue of victims' rights and the ability to be fully compensated for the loss that victims of crime suffer. The original bill dealt with the obvious injustice, but it had a sunset clause. And the reason it had that sunset clause, Mr Speaker, was because it was expected there would be a review of just that situation and of just those principles I've articulated on the basis that there might be a more coherent and comprehensive approach taken to victims' rights, including the ability to be compensated for loss other than that compensated by accident compensation. So simply rolling over the existing legislation with no change leaves the same contradictions in place and leaves a still unsatisfactory situation in place. And it still means that victims' rights, at least for those victims who have a perpetrator who themselves are subject to a compensable act, only get access to any compensation by chance or by lottery. And that isn't satisfactory. So what is needed, we still continue to need, is a coherent and comprehensive approach to victims' rights. The best that the Minister can do, and she made the announcement today, is to continue and reheat existing policies. And so this afternoon she makes an announcement that the extra money that is collected through the offenders levy, the $50 that is levied on convicted offenders, will be passed on for the benefit of various victims' programs. Well, that's the intention of it, sir. And so the announcement that the Minister has made today in her attempt to dress up as some sort of enhancement of victims' rights is nothing of the sort. It'll, if anything, lead. We will see a reduction in fines because of other measures being taken in the justice area, such as the reduction in the funding for Crown solicitors, fewer prosecutions, fewer charges taken, and therefore less collected through fines, and therefore less levied on offenders. It is contradictory. What we saw this afternoon in the announcement was the same old mutton dressed up as lamb. And, sir, that, in combination with this legislation, means we still have an unsatisfactory situation when it comes to victims' rights. So the announcement this afternoon was for $750,000 to go to victims as the additional amount that is being collected, already being collected through the offenders levy. It will affect 4,000 victims. But, Mr Speaker, there are thousands upon thousands of victims each year, many who go uncompensated as a result. And so this issue still needs to be addressed. So I should put on the record yet again in this third reading that one of the objections we have to the bill, notwithstanding that we will vote for it, is that the Minister promised that we would be consulted, all opposition parties would be consulted over a more comprehensive approach to the issues that this bill covers. That never happened. That was a promise broken. How unfortunate. As we had promises of consultation over MMP, so we had promises of consultation over this. In both cases, the promise broken. The Minister's word stands for nothing. Sir, this bill has its origins in the previous Labor government. It dealt with an obvious situation, an obvious injustice. If this bill wasn't in place, the small sliver of injustice that would remain would still be there, and so we want to cover off at least that level of injustice, and so we will continue to support the bill for that reason. But it is not satisfactory that several years after the original bill was put in place, there does not appear to have been any comprehensive work done by the Minister or successive Ministers of Justice under this government, nor the ministry they have presided over, on developing options for a better approach, a more comprehensive approach to victims' rights. That is important, and we should deal with victims' rights aside from and apart from and separately from the way we deal with our penal regime and our system of punishment for offenders. Let's call offenders and those who are antisocial and those who do bad towards others in our community, let's properly call them to account through our criminal justice system. And let's have a criminal justice system that provides appropriate levels of punishment, but also aims to rehabilitate and restore people to good character and a constructive role in society. But let us also recognise that there are victims of crime, and their issues need to be dealt with too, both through effective voice, through effective support, and where required through effective compensation. None of the measures put in place, including in this bill, get us anywhere closer to a better system or a better regime of looking after victims of crime, whether serious or non-serious crime. And so that is a situation that must change. The fact that the present Minister has taken no effort to talk to other parties about a new approach, about different approaches, about a new way forward, tells us very clearly that this Minister and this government isn't serious about new measures to deal with victims. It is about dressing up and reheating old ideas, half-baked ideas, and taking the issue no further. We need better progress. We need a better approach. And in the words of the New Zealand Law Society, when they have submitted on other legislation, when it comes to criminal justice, it is better to have a cross-party approach to it. So, sir, those discussions will begin one day, and we look forward to that, but they will begin under a different government, a new government, a Labour-led government that wants to take victims' rights seriously, one thing that simply reheating this present bill doesn't do.
I call Scott Simpson.
Mr Speaker, it's a